The nanny was accused by a billionaire until his fragile twin sons walked into the courtroom. Hi, I'm John Parker, and today's story will touch your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give your like, it means so much to me, and leave in the comments which city or country you are listening from. The courtroom was so silent that Maris Vale could hear her own heartbeat pounding like a drum. She stood in the center of the polished oak floor, her hands trembling, her dark blue uniform clinging to her thin frame. The man she once trusted, Hollis Vanmere, the billionaire whose mansion she had worked in for years, sat just a few feet away, staring at her with eyes as cold as winter steel. His expensive lawyer, Vesper Sloan, was already stacking evidence that could destroy Maris's life forever. The accusations were brutal: theft of life-saving medication. Not just any medication, the injections that kept Hollis's twin boys, Bram and Cyrus, alive. The media had turned the case into a spectacle. Nanny betrays billionaire employer, the headline screamed. But here, in this moment, the story was painfully real. Maris tried to breathe, to stand tall, but the weight of the room pressed down on her. She wasn't just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for the truth, and for the love of the two boys who once called her Auntie Maris and fell asleep holding her hands. "Miss Vale," Judge Corbett Gray said, his deep voice echoing. "Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Maris swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I never stole anything. I would rather die than harm Bram or Cyrus. They are my family." Her voice cracked. Across the room, Hollis didn't flinch. His jaw was tight, his cufflinks gleaming under the courtroom lights. To him, she was already guilty. Maris's mind spun back to the day it all started. The day Hollis summoned her to his study, the day her life shattered in seconds. She could still see the mahogany desk between them, the cold expression on his face as he accused her of selling the boy's medication on the black market. "I trusted you," he had said, voice low and sharp. "And you sold my trust for cash. Do you know how many lives those missing vials could cost?" She had begged him to believe her. She had cried until her eyes burned. But Hollis had already made up his mind. Now here she was, standing alone against his wealth, his power, and his perfect legal team. A shiver ran down her spine as she noticed the reporters scribbling notes, cameras flashing silently like watching eyes. This wasn't just a trial. This was a public execution of her reputation, but even as fear threatened to crush her, something inside Maris refused to break. "I know the truth," she told herself, "and somehow I will prove it." Judge Gray looked over his glasses and nodded for the prosecution to begin. Vesper Sloan rose gracefully, her tailored suit immaculate, her voice smooth like glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said to the jury, "this woman had everything, a home, a job, the trust of my client, and she threw it all away. This case is about betrayal." Maris clenched her fists under the table. If only someone could see what she had seen that night. The gavel struck. The trial was officially underway, and then, just as the tension reached its peak, Maris noticed something that made her blood run cold. Hollis wasn't just watching her. He was smiling. Why was he smiling? The sound of Vesper Sloan's heels clicking against the courtroom floor echoed like a countdown to Maris's doom. She walked with the confidence of someone who had never lost a case, stopping just feet away from where Maris sat. "Exhibit A," Vesper announced coolly, gesturing toward the screen as an assistant projected a grainy security video. The footage showed Maris walking down the long hallway of the Vanmere estate late at night, holding a key. Then came the damning moment. She appeared to open the storage room where the medication was kept and step inside. The jury leaned forward. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. Hollis sat motionless, his face carved from stone. That's not the whole story. Maris's heart screamed, but her lips remained pressed shut. She remembered that night clearly. Bram had spiked a fever and was struggling to breathe. She had rushed to check the doses to make sure nothing was missing. She hadn't stolen a single thing. Vesper turned back to the jury. She had sole access to this key, she said, holding up a gleaming silver copy for dramatic effect. She was alone in the house that night. When the vials went missing, there was only one logical conclusion. Maris gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She wanted to scream, "You're wrong!" But Judge Gray's warning echoed in her head. Speak only when addressed, as the prosecution laid out more evidence. Financial records showing a mysterious deposit in an account with her name, inventory logs claiming 3 missing vials, and testimonies from 2 household staff members who said Maris seemed distracted lately. Maris felt as though every memory she had in that house was being twisted into a weapon. Her chest ached as she remembered Bram and Cyrus giggling when she taught them to paint. Cyrus reaching out his tiny hand to hold hers after every injection. Bram whispering, "Don't leave," when she tucked them in at night. Would they believe this story too? Would they think she had betrayed them? "Miss Vale," Judge Gray said suddenly, pulling her from her thoughts. "You may respond briefly." Maris stood, legs shaking. "Your Honor, yes, I went into the storage room that night. Bram was sick. I needed to be sure everything was ready in case he worsened. I would never sell their medicine. I have no idea whose account that is," Vesper cut in before she could continue. "Convenient story," she said with a cold smile. "But the bank transfer happened the day after that footage. $10,000, the exact cost of 1 vial. Coincidence?" Maris's breath caught. $10,000. She didn't even have a savings account. Someone had set her up perfectly, leaving just enough of a trail to destroy her. Hollis shifted in his seat, glancing at her for the first time that day. His grey eyes were unreadable, but his jaw tightened as if he almost wanted to speak. Almost. The judge called for a short recess. As the gavel struck, the room filled with murmurs. Maris sat back down, her whole body trembling. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Strangers, journalists, even people who once worked alongside her at the Vanmere estate. Her thoughts spun. If someone could forge bank records, what else could they do? Who would dare cross Hollis Vanmere's empire and frame me in the process? And then a memory surfaced, uninvited, the night she had heard footsteps outside the storage room, just after she locked it. They weren't hers. They weren't Hollis's either. She had dismissed it as one of the guards making rounds. But now a chill ran through her. Someone had been there. Someone had wanted her to be seen as guilty. She clutched the small photo of Bram and Cyrus she kept in her pocket, her thumb brushing over their smiling faces. "I have to fight," she whispered to herself. For them. But as the courtroom doors opened again and Hollis returned with Vesper by his side, her heart sank. They looked too calm, too sure of victory, and Maris knew that the worst was still coming. When the session resumed, the air felt heavier, as though the entire courtroom had turned against Maris. Vesper Sloan wasted no time returning to the center of the room, her heels clicking like a metronome of inevitability. "Your Honor," Vesper said smoothly, "we have additional evidence to present. Digital communications." An assistant wheeled in a cart with a monitor. The screen lit up, displaying screenshots of text messages. The room leaned in collectively as Vesper read aloud. "Unknown. Payment cleared. Pick up vials tomorrow at midnight. Maris Vale. Yes, same dose as last time." A gasp rippled through the spectators. Hollis's face darkened. The words looked chillingly real, time-stamped, and traced to Maris's old number. Maris's stomach dropped. "That's a lie." The words burst from her mouth before she could stop them. Judge Gray's gavel struck once, warning her to stay composed. She forced herself to breathe, gripping the edge of the table until her nails bit into the wood. Those messages were fabricated. She hadn't even had that phone for weeks. It had shattered after falling into the estate's fountain, and she had replaced it. How could she prove that now? Vesper turned to the jury with a slow, deliberate smile. "This shows planning," she said. "Not desperation, not a mistake. This woman was trafficking medication meant for children." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Maris closed her eyes, fighting the wave of shame and panic threatening to drown her. Her heart pounded as she heard whispers in the gallery. "I knew it. She looks guilty. How could she do that to those poor boys?" Her mind screamed for someone to speak up, a witness, a friend, anyone. But the room remained silent, except for the scratching of pens and the rhythmic click of Vesper's shoes as she returned to her seat. Then something unexpected happened. Judge Gray looked up from the papers, his brow furrowed. "Mrs. Sloan," he said, "this evidence is compelling, but I will require verification of the chain of custody before admitting it officially. This is not a trial by gossip." Vesper inclined her head respectfully, but there was a flicker, just a flicker, of irritation in her eyes. Maris caught it, and for the first time that day, a small spark of hope flared in her chest. Someone had seen through the perfect facade, even if only a little. When the court recessed for lunch, Maris stepped outside into the marble hallway. The noise of reporters swelled around her like a storm, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward her face. "Maris, did you steal the medicine?" "Maris, are you going to testify?" "Maris, what do you say to the Vanmere family?" She kept walking, clutching the photo of Bram and Cyrus in her pocket like a lifeline. Her knees felt weak, but she didn't stop. Outside the courthouse, she leaned against a cold stone pillar, her breath forming pale clouds in the chilly air. Her mind replayed every detail of the past week, the night of the accusation, the police arriving at the mansion, the look of disgust on Hollis's face when he ordered her out. "Why are you doing this?" She had cried that night. "Because you left me no choice," Hollis had replied. But was that true? Or had someone whispered lies into his ear until he saw betrayal where there was none? She remembered seeing Vesper Sloan late at night near the storage wing a month ago, a sleek folder in her hands. At the time, Maris had thought nothing of it. Now it gnawed at her. Could Vesper have something to gain from removing her from the estate? Maris pressed her palm against the pillar, her breathing steadying. She would have to dig deeper, even if she had to face Hollis himself again. When the bailiff called everyone back inside, Maris squared her shoulders. Her fear hadn't gone away, but neither had her resolve. As she stepped back into the courtroom, she caught a glimpse of Hollis watching her, his expression unreadable. And then she saw something else, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as if a part of him wasn't entirely sure anymore. That flicker was enough to keep her standing tall, because deep down, she knew this fight was far from over, and someone somewhere had underestimated just how far Maris Vale was willing to go to clear her name. The afternoon session began with a sharp knock of Judge Corbett Gray's gavel. The courtroom quieted instantly, all eyes shifting toward the front. Hollis Vanmere sat perfectly still, his hands clasped together as if carved from marble. Vesper Sloan stood, ready to continue her assault, her perfect posture unshaken by the judge's earlier demand for verification. But before she could speak, Judge Gray cleared his throat. "Before we resume," he said, "the court has reviewed preliminary findings regarding the phone records tied to these text messages." Maris held her breath. The judge glanced down at the papers in front of him. "The carrier reports that the device associated with Miss Vale's number was deactivated 2 weeks before the date of the alleged messages. The prosecution will need to demonstrate how these messages were retrieved from an inactive device before we consider them admissible." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Maris felt her knees almost give out. Someone believed her. Or at least someone had confirmed she was telling the truth about that phone. Vesper's lips twitched, the first crack in her calm mask. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "we will obtain the technical details before the next session." "Do that," Judge Gray replied curtly. "Until then, these messages will remain under review." Maris exhaled shakily, clutching the edge of the defense table. This was her first real break, but she knew it wouldn't be enough. Not yet. When Vesper sat down, Hollis leaned slightly toward her. They exchanged hushed words, his jaw tightening with each response. Maris watched them, wondering if Hollis was finally beginning to doubt. The next witness was called, a housekeeper from the Vanmere estate. She was nervous, wringing her hands as she walked to the stand. "She was always too close to the boys," the woman said. "Stayed up with them at night, spent too much time with them. It was strange, Maris flinched at the words. Strange, staying with Bram and Cyrus during their pain was what kept them alive some nights. Isn't it true, Vesper pressed, that Miss Vale often commented on the cost of the boy's medication? Yes, the housekeeper admitted. She once said it was worth more than her house, the jury murmured. Maris wanted to shout that she had said it in shock, not envy, but she remained silent. Vesper smiled slightly, satisfied, then dismissed the witness. Maris's heart pounded harder with every accusation, every distorted memory. It felt like the walls were closing in on her. When the court adjourned for the day, she walked out into the evening air, her steps slow and heavy. The courthouse steps were lined with journalists, their cameras flashing, voices shouting questions. Miss Vale, how do you respond to today's testimony? Did you envy the Vanmere family's wealth? Do you think the boys will testify against you? Maris said nothing. She kept walking until she reached the quiet street beyond the courthouse. That night, in her small apartment, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the photo of Bram and Cyrus that she had carried all day. Tears welled in her eyes. They think I betrayed you, she whispered into the empty room. They think I would let you suffer just for money. Her chest ached as memories flooded her. Cyrus gripping her hand during injections. Bram laughing softly when she told him bedtime stories. Their voices calling her Auntie Maris. She couldn't let this trial end with them believing she was a monster. Maris wiped her eyes and opened a worn notebook filled with her own handwritten logs. Every injection, every doctor's visit, every late-night fever she had handled alone. These pages were her truth, and she was going to use them. As the night stretched on, she gathered every paper, every note, every scrap of proof she could find. Tomorrow, she would walk back into that courtroom with her head held high. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt a flicker of strength, a reminder that she wasn't just a maid. She was their protector, and protect them she would. But as she packed her evidence, she didn't notice the figure standing across the street, watching her apartment windows from the shadows. The fight for the truth was about to get far more dangerous. Morning sunlight spilled through the courthouse windows, catching dust motes in the air like tiny sparks. Maris Vale walked up the stone steps slowly, but with a new resolve. She held a small folder to her chest, her handwritten logs, the records she had guarded for years. Every page was proof that she had never missed a dose, never failed Bram and Cyrus, never betrayed them. Inside the courtroom, the mood was different. The press benches were full, reporters whispering about yesterday's revelation regarding the deactivated phone. Hollis Vanmere sat stiffly, but his usual composure seemed frayed. He kept adjusting his cufflinks, his gaze darting between Vesper Sloan and the judge. When Judge Corbett Gray called the court to order, Maris stood before anyone could stop her. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady but urgent, "I have something to submit." The bailiff carried her folder to the judge, who flipped through the pages, his brows rising slightly. "These are medical logs," he said, scanning a page. "Dated, time-stamped entries." "Yes, Your Honor," Maris replied. "I wrote them every day for 3 years. Every dose, every symptom, every emergency call. They match the hospital's records. You can verify them. I never skipped a dose. Not once." Vesper Sloan stood, her calm smile returning. "Your Honor, this is convenient. Anyone could write a few pages of notes. These aren't a few pages," Maris counted, taking a step forward. "They're hundreds. And every one of them has been signed off by the night nurse who came twice a week." "Check the hospital records," the judge nodded slowly. "We will." "Bailiff, request confirmation from Westbridge Children's Hospital immediately." A flicker of relief passed over Maris's face, but it was short-lived. Vesper stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air like glass. "Even if the logs are accurate, they don't explain the missing vials or the deposit that appeared in Miss Vale's name." Maris's heart clenched. "Because someone else took them," she said quietly. "Do you have proof?" Vesper asked, her tone almost mocking. Maris hesitated, then remembered the faint sound of footsteps she had heard that night, the shadow she had glimpsed outside the storage room. "I saw someone near the storage wing," she said slowly. A woman. It wasn't a nurse and it wasn't me. I didn't think it was important at the time. But now I know it was. Vesper's face remained impassive, but a muscle in her jaw ticked. The judge leaned forward. "Can you identify this person, Miss Vale?" Maris swallowed. She had no picture, no proof, just her memory. But she could still see the glint of light off a sleek black folder in the woman's hand. "I believe it was someone close to Mr. Vanmere," she said. "Someone who had access to the house when he wasn't there." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Hollis's head snapped toward her, his grey eyes flashing. "Are you accusing my staff?" he demanded. "I'm accusing whoever framed me," Maris said, her voice shaking now. "And whoever took those vials while I was putting Bram back to bed that night." For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Judge Gray raised his gavel for silence. "This court will review hospital confirmations and house security logs before the next session. If there is any evidence of additional access to that storage room, we will hear it." The gavel struck once, hard. As the room emptied for the recess, Maris felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She gripped the bench until her knuckles turned white. Behind her, she heard voices, reporters whispering about the possibility of a setup, murmurs of doubt about the billionaire's perfect case. But just as hope began to stir in Maris's chest, she caught a glimpse of Vesper Sloan standing near the door, speaking quietly to Hollis. Her expression was calm, but her eyes, they glinted with something sharper, something dangerous. Vesper turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Maris for just a second. A slow, almost imperceptible smile curved her lips. It wasn't over. If anything, it was only just beginning. The next morning, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. The story had spread across Westbridge overnight. Nanny claimed she was framed. Logs could clear her name. Journalists filled the benches, eager to see what would unfold. Maris Vale sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly, trying to stay calm as the bailiff brought forward the hospital's verification. Judge Corbett Gray adjusted his glasses and read silently for a long moment before speaking. "These logs," he said at last, "match hospital records to the minute. Every dose Miss Vale recorded was also logged by Westbridge Children's Hospital." A ripple of sound passed through the room. Maris closed her eyes, her lips parting in relief. Someone had finally confirmed her truth. But before she could exhale fully, Vesper Sloan rose smoothly from her chair. "Your Honor," she said, voice crisp, "that only proves she administered the medication she had, not that she didn't steal more for profit." "The missing vials still have not been accounted for," Judge Gray nodded, "which is why we've also obtained access logs from the Vanmere estate for the night in question." The screen lit up again, showing time-stamped security data. Maris's stomach twisted as the record displayed 2314. Maris Vale enters storage wing. 2326. Unknown access override from external keypad. 2328. Storage door opened again. The gallery erupted with shocked whispers. Maris's head shut up. "See?" she cried. "I locked it. Someone else came in after me." Hollis Vanmere's face had gone pale. He leaned toward Vesper, his voice low but urgent. "I was out of town that night. No one else had that code." Vesper's jaw tightened. "Then someone stole it." Judge Gray banged the gavel for silence. "We will have the security expert testify." A tall, nervous-looking technician took the stand. He explained that the code used that night belonged to a temporary access profile set up for legal staff. The entire room turned toward Vesper Sloan. Maris felt her pulse hammering. Vesper's expression didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something, irritation, maybe fear, in her eyes. "Temporary profiles can be exploited," Vesper said smoothly, crossing her arms. "Anyone with access to my office could have duplicated that code." Maris stared at her, every muscle in her body tense. She remembered that night more clearly now. The faint click of heels on the marble hallway, the dark silhouette moving past the storage wing. It had been Vesper's height, Vesper's gait. She turned to face Hollis directly. "I told you someone else was there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you." For a split second, Hollis's cold exterior cracked. His jaw clenched, his gaze shifting away as if he didn't want to see the weight of his own doubt. The judge ordered a short recess. As the crowd dispersed, Hollis remained seated, staring at the table. When he finally rose, Maris saw something she hadn't seen in days: hesitation. In the hallway, reporters swarmed, shouting questions. Maris ignored them, stepping into a quiet alcove, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Then she heard a voice behind her. "You're playing a dangerous game," Vesper said softly. Maris turned slowly. Vesper stood in the shadow of the archway, her eyes cold as ice. "I didn't steal anything," Maris said, her voice firm. Vesper smiled faintly, a predator's smile. "Truth doesn't always win, Miss Vale. You should remember that." She walked away without another word, her heels echoing on the tile. Maris's breath shook, but her resolve hardened. The pieces were finally aligning, and for the first time, Hollis Vanmere's empire wasn't unshakable. She would not back down. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. And she had a feeling that the next witness might change everything. When the courtroom reconvened after recess, the tension was electric. Everyone could sense that the case was shifting, the once perfect prosecution beginning to crack. Judge Corbett Gray's expression was grave as he called the next witness, the hospital liaison, Dr. Kira Maddox. Dr. Maddox walked to the stand, her white coat crisp, her dark hair tied neatly back. She spoke with quiet authority, her voice calm but firm. "I have been the primary physician overseeing Bram and Cyrus Vanmere's treatment for 3 years, she began. "Miss Vale's logs are accurate. Her diligence is the reason those boys are alive today." A collective murmur swept through the gallery. Hollis's head turned sharply toward the doctor, his grey eyes narrowing. Dr. Maddox continued, "I also reviewed the hospital's medication shipment records. There was no discrepancy until after a legal audit was requested by Mr. Vanmere's own legal team. The timing of the missing vials coincides exactly with that audit period." Maris's heart pounded. She wasn't imagining it. This had been orchestrated. Vesper Sloan rose from her seat, her smile as polished as glass. "Doctor, are you suggesting that someone on the legal team manipulated inventory during an audit?" "I'm saying the timing is suspicious," Dr. Maddox replied evenly, "and that someone wanted it to appear as if Miss Vale was responsible." The room buzzed with whispers. For the first time since the trial began, Maris saw Hollis's mask of certainty falter completely. He looked down at his hands, his jaw tight. Judge Gray leaned back in his chair, considering the testimony carefully. "This court will subpoena the audit records and interview all personnel with access during that period." Vesper's expression didn't change, but Maris could feel the tension radiating from her. Something about the lawyer's stillness felt dangerous, like a storm building under the surface. When court adjourned for the day, Hollis remained seated, unmoving, while Vesper packed up her files. Maris stood slowly, her folder clutched in her hands, and turned to face him. "You've known me for years," she said softly, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "You've seen me with your sons. Do you really believe I could do this?" Hollis didn't answer at first. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment there was no billionaire, no nanny, just two people who both loved the same children. Finally his voice came, low and strained. "If you're innocent, then someone very close to me isn't." He left without another word, but the weight of what he had just admitted hung in the air like a storm cloud. That night, Maris returned to her small apartment, exhausted but unable to sleep. She sat at her table, staring at the photo of Bram and Cyrus, whispering a promise to them. "I will not let them grow up thinking I betrayed them, no matter what it costs me." As midnight approached, a knock sounded at her door. Maris froze. No one ever came to see her this late. She opened the door cautiously and found a young estate guard standing there, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered, handing her a small USB drive. "But you need to see this. It's security footage from that night, the hallway camera. They told me to delete it, but I couldn't." Before Maris could reply, he turned and hurried down the hall, disappearing into the night. Her hands shook as she slid the drive into her old laptop. The screen flickered to life, and there it was, the grainy footage of the storage hallway. First, Maris appeared on screen, locking the door and walking away. Minutes later, another figure emerged, tall, slim, carrying a folder. The camera caught her profile as she entered the storage wing. Vesper Sloan. Maris's breath caught. She had proof, but as she stared at the screen, a single thought chilled her blood. If she had this proof, then Vesper would know someone had betrayed her, and that meant things were about to get even more dangerous. The next day in court would not just decide her freedom. It might decide everything. The morning sun had barely risen when Maris arrived at the courthouse, clutching the USB drive like it was her last breath of air. Her palms were damp, her heart racing. Today had to be the day everything turned, or the day everything collapsed for good. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Word had leaked that new evidence might surface, and every seat was filled. Hollis Vanmere sat rigid in his chair, his grey eyes sharper than ever, as though he already sensed what was coming. Vesper Sloan stood at the prosecution table, perfectly composed, but her fingers drummed against her legal pad, a sign of unease that Maris did not miss. When Judge Corbett Gray called the session to order, Maris rose to her feet. "Your Honor," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days, "I have security footage that was not submitted to the court. It was recovered by an estate guard at risk to his own job. I ask that you review it." The bailiff carried the USB drive to the judge. He motioned for the technician to display the footage on the large screen. The room fell into a tense silence as the grainy video played. First came Maris, locking the storage room door, her hands careful, her expression tired but calm. She left the frame. And then, moments later, another figure appeared. The courtroom seemed to lean forward in unison. Vesper Sloan entered the frame, glancing around before approaching the keypad and opening the door with a code. She stepped inside and disappeared from view for several minutes before re-emerging with what looked like a folder tucked under her arm. Gasps erupted around the room. Maris's heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment that could free her. Vesper's face remained calm, but her body was motionless, frozen like marble. "Mrs. Sloan," Judge Gray said, his tone suddenly sharper, "would you care to explain why you were present in the storage wing on the night of the alleged theft?" Vesper rose slowly, her voice smooth as silk. "Yes, Your Honor. I was retrieving legal documents Mr. Vanmere had requested. The timing is unfortunate, but it was purely administrative." Maris clenched her fists. "Those weren't legal documents," she said, her voice rising. "You were carrying a sealed package. I saw it on the footage. That was the medication shipment." "Objection!" Vesper snapped, but her voice had lost its usual cool edge. "Overruled," Judge Gray said, his eyes narrowing. "The court will examine the footage frame by frame. Until we have clarity, this evidence stands." Hollis Vanmere shifted in his seat, his face pale. He turned toward Vesper, his voice low but audible. "You told me you never had access to that room." For the first time since the trial began, Vesper faltered. "Hollis!" But he raised a hand to silence her. The judge ordered the security expert back to the stand. He confirmed that the code used that night matched the legal team's temporary profile, and that there was no record of Maris's code being used again after she locked the door. The room was buzzing now, reporters scribbling notes furiously, cameras flashing. The perfect case against Maris was unraveling thread by thread. Vesper straightened, her eyes narrowing like a cornered predator. "This proves nothing," she said. "We don't know what was in her hands. We don't know what she did inside that room." But the calm confidence she had worn like armor was gone. Judge Gray leaned forward, his gavel poised. We will subpoena your office records and the delivery manifest for that week, Mrs. Sloan. And if they do not match—" He let the sentence hang, heavy as a verdict. Maris sat back down slowly, her chest heaving. For the first time since this nightmare began, she felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. But as she glanced across the room, she caught the look in Vesper's eyes. Not fear, but calculation. This wasn't over, not yet, and Maris knew that if Vesper had gone this far to destroy her, she wouldn't go down quietly. Tomorrow's session might not just reveal the truth, it might finally bring every secret in Hollis Vanmere's empire crashing into the open. The next day, the courthouse was overflowing. Reporters lined the steps, cameras clicked relentlessly, and even strangers who had never met Maris Vale were whispering about the Nanny who might take down a billionaire's entire legal team. Inside, the tension was so thick it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. Judge Corbett Gray entered and called the session to order. The subpoenas had been answered. Several thick folders lay on the judge's bench, their contents sealed until this very moment. "Mrs. Sloan," the judge said, his voice firm, "these are your firm's internal records and shipping manifests. The court will review them publicly." Vesper Sloan stood tall, her chin slightly raised, as though daring the room to doubt her. But Maris noticed the faintest trace of sweat near her temple. The clerk opened the first folder and projected the documents on the screen. It was a list of medication deliveries for the month the theft occurred. 2 entries were highlighted, 3 vials marked as removed during legal review. "And who authorized this?" Judge Gray asked. The clerk turned to the second page, showing an electronic signature. Vesper Sloan's. Gasps erupted across the room. Hollis Vanmere's face went pale, his jaw clenching. He turned toward Vesper, his voice low and shaking. "You told me you had nothing to do with the storage room, that you never touched those vials." Vesper's voice was cool but strained now. "Hollis, this isn't what it looks like," but he was already standing, pointing a finger toward her. "You framed her. You let me believe Maris was a thief while you were stealing from my son's treatment stockpile." The courtroom buzzed like a hive of bees. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing so fast the air glittered. Judge Gray struck the gavel. "Order!" He looked directly at Vesper. "These signatures, these timestamps, and this footage place you at the scene on the exact night of the disappearance. Do you have anything to say before we proceed to formal charges?" For a moment, Vesper's mask slipped entirely. The calm, perfect lawyer was gone, replaced by someone cold and cornered. "I did what I had to do," she said finally, her voice sharp as a knife. "Those vials were worth more than my entire annual salary. Do you think anyone would notice? 3 doses gone when this man spends millions without blinking. I took an opportunity, and she was the perfect scapegoat." The room fell into stunned silence. Maris's breath caught. After days of humiliation, after nights spent alone wondering if the truth would ever surface, she had just heard the confession she prayed for. The judge's face hardened. "Bailiff, take Mrs. Sloan into custody. This court will file charges of theft, fraud, and evidence tampering." Vesper didn't fight. She handed over her briefcase with mechanical precision as the bailiff placed her in handcuffs. The image was surreal. The same woman who had towered over Maris, tearing her apart with elegant words, was now being led out of the courtroom. But the session wasn't over. Judge Gray turned to Hollis Vanmere. "Mr. Vanmere, do you wish to make a statement before we proceed to the verdict?" The billionaire stood, looking like a man carrying the weight of a crumbling empire. He turned toward Maris, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it. "I accused you without listening. I let my anger and fear blind me. I let her convince me you were dangerous, and I was wrong." Maris met his eyes. Her heart pounded, not with fear this time, but with the release of it. For the first time since this nightmare began, Hollis looked like more than a billionaire. He looked like a father who realized what his choices had nearly cost. Judge Gray struck the gavel again. This court will reconvene after a short recess to deliver its final decision. The room erupted into chaos, journalists rushing outside to send updates. Spectators whispering in disbelief. Maris remained seated, her hands gripping the bench. It was almost over, but the most important part was still to come, whether the court would truly clear her name, and whether Bram and Cyrus would still see her as the woman who had loved them more than life itself. Her fate and theirs hung in the balance as the judge prepared to return. The courtroom filled once more, hushed and reverent as Judge Corbett Gray returned to the bench. Maris Vale stood slowly, her legs trembling, as though her entire body understood that this moment would decide everything. Judge Gray's voice was steady, deliberate. After reviewing all evidence, testimony, and new revelations presented to this court, he paused, letting the silence stretch until every breath in the room seemed to stop. This court finds Miss Maris Vale not guilty of all charges. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Maris's knees nearly buckled, tears stinging her eyes. She clasped the edge of the table, holding herself upright as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court acknowledges that Miss Vale's diligence and care for Bram and Cyrus Vanmere saved their lives on numerous occasions. Her name will be fully cleared in all public records. The sound of pens scratching, cameras flashing, and whispers flooding the gallery seemed to come from far away. Maris could barely process the words. She was free, and then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Bram and Cyrus entered, one using his walker, the other guiding his motorized chair. The room fell completely silent as the boys made their slow way down the aisle. Their small faces were pale but determined, their eyes locked on Maris. When they reached her, Bram let go of his walker and wrapped his arms around her waist. Cyrus reached for her hand, his voice trembling but clear enough for everyone to hear. "She never hurt us," he said. "She's the one who takes care of us. She's our Maris." The room erupted with emotion, some people crying openly, others covering their mouths in shock. Even Judge Gray removed his glasses, his expression softening. Across the aisle, Hollis Vanmere stood motionless, his face pale, the weight of shame visible in the slump of his shoulders. Slowly, he crossed the room and stopped in front of Maris and the boys. "Maris," he said quietly, his voice breaking, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth. I failed you and I failed them. I let my fear turn me into something I swore I'd never be. You never betrayed us." "I betrayed you." Maris held the boys close, her tears flowing freely now. "I didn't fight just for me," she said, her voice soft but fierce. "I fought so they'd know who I really was." Hollis nodded slowly, turning to look at Bram and Cyrus. "If you'll let me," he said quietly. "I want to make this right, for all of us." The judge struck the gavel one last time. "This case is closed." The reporters stood, shouting questions, but no one moved as Maris, Bram, and Cyrus walked together toward the courtroom doors. Hollis followed at a respectful distance, his expression no longer one of power, but of humility. Outside, a crowd had gathered. When Maris stepped into the sunlight, the people erupted into applause, not for the scandal, but for the woman who had stood alone against lies and refused to break. She looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. "I'm John Parker, and remember, every story hides a truth." And then, as the final scene played out, Maris turned to the crowd, still holding the boys' hands. Her voice was steady, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "Tell me in the comments where you're listening from," John Parker's narration urged warmly. "Share this story so others can hear how courage and truth can win. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to Invisible Hearts. We share stories like this every week." As the video faded, the last image was Maris walking down the courthouse steps with Bram and Cyrus by her side. Free, vindicated, and stronger than ever, a survivor whose love had been tested, but never broken, because in the end, the truth had not just set her free, it had rebuilt everything she thought she'd lost, and for the first time in a long time, Maris Vale smiled.